U.S. Air Force will be launching its mysterious X-37 from a Falcon 9 rocket on September 7th. The launch is no secret. What is secret is what it'll be doing up there in space. This will be the 5th flight of the craft, and as with the last flights, its mission is classified. Each flight has been longer than the last, with the most recent lasting nearly 2 years in orbit. The unmanned spaceplane is similar in appearance to the space shuttle, however much smaller. It is 29 feet in length and 9.5 feet tall. It has a wingspan of 15 feet and a payload bay of 7 feet by 4 feet. Inside the payload bay is carried a solar panel for power and can carry 500 to 600 pounds of equipment. The X-37 is a grandchild of the X-20 Dyna-Soar. The Dyna-Soar was a U.S. Air Force manned spaceplane designed in the 1950s. The government eventually canceled the project due to cost and technology limitations and went with the capsule design to launch the first Americans into space. A few decades after the Dyna-Soar came the ReFly, or the reusable flyback satellite. This vehicle appears very similar to the X-37. The craft was designed by Rockwell International, which was then acquired by Boeing, who used the design to construct the X-37. NASA awarded Boeing funding to develop a reusable spacecraft for testing and to repair satellites in orbit. In 2004, the program was transferred to DARPA, which is a government agency which develops and studies advanced and future technologies. At that point, the X-37 became classified, and eventually taken over by the U.S. Air Force. Again, what the X-37 is doing up there is secret. The Air Force's official explanation is that the spacecraft is designed to perform risk reduction, experimentation, and concept of operational development for reusable spacecraft technologies. So far, only 2 experiments on board have been publicly acknowledged. A NASA material science experiment, and an ion thruster being used for future spacecraft propulsion. Any attempt to figure out what other uses the X-37 is being used for must take into account a few clues. First, the craft is under control of the military, not NASA, therefore it must have some sort of military application. Second, its flights have all been very long in duration. Whatever they are testing requires long exposure to space. Third, it has a lot of fuel. The original design called for 3,100 meters per second of delta V. Delta V is basically the measure of how much you can maneuver in space. The space shuttle, for comparison, only had about 300 meters per second delta V. This larger amount of fuel could indicate that the craft is meant to rendezvous with satellites or to get into position to fly over a certain area of the Earth. Fourth, all flights have been in low Earth orbit, typically lower than 250 miles in altitude. This low orbit is used for many commercial satellites, several military recon satellites, and manned space missions. And finally, it is reusable. Reusability comes at a high cost. The heat shield, landing gear, navigation equipment, etc. are very heavy, which really limits the payload that it can carry into space. The spacecraft in total weighs 11,000 pounds, while its payload is only about 500 pounds, so whatever is being launched in its payload bay must be very important to not only bring back, but also to have the spaceplane be able to be used again. With these in mind, there are several guesses as to the X-37B's purpose. The X-20 Dyna-Soar was originally considered to be used as a bomber, with a crew of 3 on board that would launch into orbit armed with several nuclear bombs. They would then re-enter the atmosphere, drop the bombs, and return home using a jet engine. If the X-37 is a bomber, it could sit in orbit for years, and once the signal is given, change its orbit to target a location, release its weapons, and return home. The spaceplane's development also coincides with the US's development of its Prompt Global Strike program, whose goal is to be able to strike anywhere in the world in less than 1 hour. However, this application is unlikely due to its small payload capacity, and it would also violate the 1967 Outer Space Treaty, which bans placing weapons of mass destruction into orbit. Many people have stated they believe that the X-37's purpose may be to destroy or disable enemy satellites. It could maneuver to get in close and either use lasers or kinetic weapons against the target. It makes sense that some people would think this, as the X-37's original purpose was to rendezvous with satellites and repair them. However, despite having a large amount of fuel for maneuvering, it still does not have enough to make this likely. Also, the military wouldn't need a reusable spacecraft for this. It makes much more sense to have a dedicated spacecraft weighing all 11,000 pounds with more fuel to complete the task than it does to only have 500 pounds worth of gear that can fit in the back of the spaceplane. The X-37 may be being used for reconnaissance. The craft would carry an array of cameras and sensors to spy on an enemy nation. Its extra fuel could be used to change its orbit to get into position to fly over a target. This could prove beneficial compared to conventional recon satellites that fly in very predictable orbits, and an enemy can simply hide any sensitive material when one passes overhead. Typically, recon satellites have been very large and bulky. However, companies like Planet Labs have developed their Dove CubeSats that are less than 1 foot in length and only 4 inches wide and in width. These small satellites can produce relatively high-resolution images of the Earth for their size. And finally, the last and least exciting is that the X-37B is simply being used for research. After all, this is what the US government has been claiming all along. The craft could carry various experiments on board to see how it reacts to long-term exposure in outer space. Testing could include new armor and shields to protect against micrometeorites, the effects of long-duration spaceflight on various systems, and testing out future methods of spacecraft propulsion. The infamous EM drive, which seems to defy the laws of physics, has been rumored to be being tested on the craft. This operation seems to be the most likely use of the X-37, considering all the information available. However, only time will tell what benefit the spaceplane will bring to the US Air Force.